Hello and welcome back for another episode of the ADHD Goals Podcast. I have a really exciting guest for you today, and I've got my dog barking in the background, so hello, Coconut. But other than that, I've got with me Dr. Matt Zekresky, and he is a clinical psychologist, a professional speaker. He utilizes an eclectic approach to meet the specific needs of his neurodivergent clients. And not only that, he is also an author and co-founder of the NeuroDivergent Collective. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Matt. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. And I have to ask, because I know your accent just sounds normal to you, but as an American hearing it, did you name your dog Coconut just so it would sound brilliant in your accent? Because just for our listeners, can you just say Coconut again? Everyone's going to really appreciate it.
Coconut.
It's like orchestral music.
Well, I'm from the Midlands in England, and I suppose there's a difference between there's a divide between the north and the south. And so I'm very nut, bus, grass, that sort of thing. And so, I think a lot of people here would be like, that sounds funny, but as opposed to orchestral. But it wasn't me that named the dog. One of my daughters, we were sat with, because he's a cockapoo, we were sat with a book, because it's the first dog I've ever owned. So I needed a book to find out what I was going to do, or what I needed to do. And I had some friends over, and we sat and was asking her what she wanted to call the dog. And she thought for a second, and she said Coconut. And I thought that was amazing because I like the alliteration in it, Coconut the cockapoo. And it stuck. So yeah, it's
Brilliant.
It should, all the plaudits should go to her, really.
Well, you tell her that Dr. Matt says good job.
I will.
Yeah.
So, I must thank you for joining me today, because we did have it scheduled for about a month ago, but there was an issue on my end with some confusing links, and so I apologize for that. But thank you very much for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah. Well, you are absolutely worth waiting for. I'm such a fan of what you do, and you approach this with this like perfect middle ground between, what you know, and you know it really well. And also, hey, I'm going to talk to people who know more than I do. And I find a lot of podcasts don't hit that middle ground. Right.
Yeah.
So I think I'll go to you for, creating this space and having people like me in to hopefully help your listeners learn a little something.
Yeah. I'm in my, I think it was what I did a strengths assessment, and love of learning was my top one. So, it can be a deficit at times, because I might have a bias to learning rather than doing, which is an avoidance saboteur. But yeah, I do really enjoy learning. And so, to be able to pick your brain today on the brain is going to be really fascinating for me. So I wonder if you can start off by telling us a little bit about your own personal background, with ADHD, and tell us a bit about your story.
So I was identified as gifted in second grade here in the US, which is, somewhere around 8 years old. And that's a pretty common age for identification here in the United States. And at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, we just thought gifted meant smart, right? It's like, oh, really smart, you'll go to Oxford, right? I'll adapt the analogy. And that was that. And one of the things we know now is that giftedness is a neurodivergence, right? It's literally a different brain, just like ADHD is a different brain. And one neurodivergence drastically predicts others.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're gifted, you are significantly more likely than the general population to be ADHD. Of course, nobody told me that. So I sort of get through school. A lot of things come super easy to me, but you start to see some of the challenges associated with ADHD. My backpack was a mess. I never knew when things were. I often forgot there was homework. I would forget there was quizzes or tests. And what happens is when you're really smart and things come easy to you, you can study for a test 5 minutes before it happens, get a 93 out of 100, and the teacher says, "Good job." And you say, "Well, I'll just keep doing this." Right.
Yeah.
All my ADHDers out there, the reason we keep procrastinating is we keep getting away with it.
Right. Yeah.
So wasn't until high school that the strains on my brain got more than I could handle just by sort of charm and hard work. And when we looked at it, it's like, oh no, you are clearly ADHD.
Mm.
We just didn't see it for a long time because of how smart you were. And so that was all people saw. So the term for that is twice exceptional, right? So gifted plus a learning difference, in this case, ADHD. And so then we got accommodations for that, and things became a lot easier for me.
Mm.
But, so now as a psychologist, I get to work with kids who have brains like mine. And if a kid comes to me with an ADHD evaluation, I'm like, did anybody ever check your IQ? And they're like, nah, I'm dumb. I have ADHD. I'm like, I'm not sure if you're dumb. I think there are parts of your brain that make school hard for you.
Mm.
But school is not a good metric of how intelligent you are. Right? A
Yeah.
lot of kids who are very intelligent don't do well in school because school is about following the rules. And, Lawrence, how well do ADHDers do with rules? Are we big rules people? Uh,
Well, I would argue. Well, I would say it can be challenging at times, depending on how you present your ADHD. So for me, I am or at school when I was younger, I wasn't the classic boy type ADHD of being restless and therefore finding it very difficult to sit down. I have like a big avoidance of conflict, and so the need to be obedient meant that I was very able to follow rules. But all my not hyperactivity, but restlessness was internal, which, because that's all internal, you don't really see it, and therefore you don't really realize that you're different to anybody else. It's only later on in life, when you're no longer in the the structure of schools or whatever, when you're unleashed on the world yourself, and the wheels start coming off. But yeah, I wonder. So, I mean, you use the term gifted, and I'm not sure how. I have not really come across that so much here in the UK. If I think about it, when my daughters were at a nursery, they did go. There was somebody there who was gifted. So I don't know if it's a term that we're using more often now. So yeah, I wonder what the process is to becoming diagnosed as gifted.
and I mean, and thank you for bringing that up, because there are some things that Britain does much better with psychology than the US, and there's some things that the US does better than Britain. You guys have really, you guys are the world leaders in understanding PDA, right? Pathological demand avoidance. We are fighting that fight on our side of the ocean. Whereas I think the US is much better at understanding giftedness. And I have, several colleagues that I've talked to in the UK over the years, and they've all sort of said the same thing. It's like, we want to get to where you are. So, and I don't know nearly enough about the systems there to venture a guess as to why,
Yeah.
but gifted is an IQ of 130 or higher. And the IQ of 130 is the 98th percentile. So if there were 100 kids in your daughter's primary, her and maybe one other kid would be the most intelligent. Their brains would work differently. And there's a lot of misconceptions around giftedness, not the least of which, right, is that it's some sort of elite thing.
Mm.
But it's gifted education is special education, right? We have kids who just learn differently. They learn faster. They want to go deeper. And the way they interact with material means that material needs to be presented in a different way.
Mm.
A lot of schools struggle to accommodate that because, you can imagine the world is built for neurotypical people, right? Something about 80% of people are neurotypical. So if you were going to design a system, you would design that system for the most people, right? We call this teaching to the middle, right? That's where most people are. I mean, if you thought about it, how tall would you say all the doorways in your house are? What?
Like just I'm not really good at that, but maybe like 180 meters, or possibly two. I don't know if that's too big, but
Let's just use two. It's an easier number.
yeah, yeah.
So, And the reason that most doors are that size is that most people can walk comfortably through a 2-meter door.
Yeah.
You had a buddy who was 3 meters tall, you wouldn't build your house for that guy who's 3 meters tall, because that's a lot of extra work and a lot of accommodations that most people don't
Yeah.
need, right? But if you have somebody who's 3 meters tall, then you'd have to make some sort of accommodations for them. Maybe you hang out in the backyard or something like that.
Hmm.
So so we're sort of pushing this on 2 fronts. Like, well, one front is the brain science part of it, that it is the gifted brain is a different brain, and we can point at those reasons. And also what that looks like in systems, namely school and work, because people with gifted brains, they need different things to be successful. And we're trying to, explain to the powers that be what those things are and how to implement.
Yeah. I have had a couple of conversations that have sort of dipped into universal design, which is the concept of exactly what you're saying. The way we are currently is designing for the majority, whereas if we maybe start to look at how we can design for the edges, then it will include everybody, and we may be moving in a better direction. So I think that is certainly an interesting message to get out there, or a direction to go in. I don't know if it's worth just circling back to something that you mentioned, but you mentioned the PDA, and I think I've briefly, could you explain what that is?
Yeah. So PDA, which is referred to in the literature as pathological demand avoidance,
Yeah.
the people in that community are reframing that as persistent drive for autonomy, which is
Mhm.
frank or less pathologizing way to say it.
Yeah.
It's a subset of symptoms within the neurodivergent community. Now, it's
Yeah.
most associated with autism,
Mhm.
uh, but it can show up in giftedness, ADHD. I work with a dyslexic client who's also PDA. And some people say, like, oh, well, you've just missed the autism. Like, no, I'm an expert in this. I've done several assessments with this kid. He's not autistic. He is neurodivergent, though. And that's how his brain shows up with his PDA. And you can think of it like this. It's actually very analogous to ADHD, right? So I'm sure you've heard some people tell you some version of, well, I mean, nobody likes to focus on the stuff that they don't want to do, right?
Mhm.
So don't we all have ADHD? And it's,
Mhm.
I both know ADHD isn't a I don't want to, it's an I can't.
Mhm.
I would love to be focusing on this thing, but my brain is not letting me, right? I'm
Mhm.
flexing the muscle and there's nothing there. PDA is similar in the sense of n- very lots of people don't like to have demands put on them, right? It's stress to our bodies. But for most people, that amount of stress is within normal, manageable limits, right? It's
Mhm.
like, I don't want to do this, but I'll do it, or I don't want to do it, but I'll do it later. That's all regular. When it becomes pathological is when the body shuts down, right? And what we see with PDA people is that regular everyday demands can be so stressful to the body, can trigger that fight or flight system that people actually will shut down over something as simple as, would you like beans on toast for breakfast?
Mhm.
And the idea of you can't make me eat breakfast sort of sends the brain and body spiraling downward into this, in this sort of locked place. So it's a incredibly tricky condition to manage because the way the body is seeing the demands isn't external in nature, where it's, I don't want to do my homework, I don't want to take out the garbage, I don't want to go to the gym. It's, someone is making me feel like I have to shower,
Mhm.
therefore I shower.
Yeah.
And so you're really sort of reorganizing the whole system over how to help people make things that they're in more control, that they have more autonomy, and move them slowly up the ladder from there.
Yeah, 'cause I wonder how you sort of deal with that in the work that you do, because for me, part of the coaching that I do is, I could listen to a client and then I could say, "Oh, you've just told me about this. Here's the solution." And whereas what you're saying is that with PDA, if I just say, "Here's the solution, do it," they're going to go, "No, you just told me to do it. I don't want to do it." So it's about coming to talking it through so they almost come up with the solution themselves. And then it's it slightly removes or reduces that barrier to them then being able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the analogies I use all the time is it's the difference between top-down thinking and bottom-up thinking.
Right.
Bottom-up thinking is the default is you do nothing. The default is I never get out of bed today. Every decision you make, everything you're able to do is value added, right? So if all you do, if you're struggling with any mental health condition, right? Depression, anxiety, panic attacks, PDA, whatever it is, the first thing you got to do in the morning is get out of bed. And some people can't do that. Everything we do is a value added. And if you give people options and choice, they maintain that sense of autonomy. They have a hand on the steering wheel, right? And you're able to create this and, what we would, what I refer to as behavioral momentum. The more choices we make, the more choices we're able to make, right? We start the ball rolling downhill. And one of the talks that people ask me to give a lot is how to get kids unstuck.
Mhm.
Because when we grind to a halt and we can't do anything, that's really hard, right? That's hard to get people moving in a positive direction. So, there's a lot of different strategies for getting people unstuck so we can start creating that behavioral momentum and moving them downhill.
Yeah. I know. I'm just as you were saying that, I was just thinking about. I don't know if this is the same thing, but there's quite often times when I'm having conversations with people, and when somebody drops something into a conversation, and then it's one of those typical things where it usually should have a automatic response like, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," or something along those lines. Whenever those situations arise, I feel I am now forced to say that socially appropriate response. But if I say it, then it's not going to sound genuine because I'm queued up to say it. So I won't say it. And I'll think I will say it in my way later. But because of the social norms, it feels like I'm being rude.
I mean, what you just named, the fact that how that sort of PDA feel can show up in any neurodivergent person, right?
Mm,
Our desire for authenticity and the fact that we often create friction with general social norms.
mm,
One of my clients, he recently had a death in the family. A great uncle died. And the
mhm,
guy was, by all accounts, a jerk, right?
mm,
I mean, just a total awful human. And everyone's like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And my client was like, "Why?"
mhm,
He was a jerk. And people are like, "Well, you don't speak ill of the dead." And you gotta love this kid. He goes, "It's not like he can hear me."
mhm,
Oh, and I mean, he's like, "I was being authentic." I'm like, "You were absolutely being authentic." And I think there's a middle ground. What I try to teach a lot of my clients is what we call being pro-social.
mhm,
Pro-social is the middle ground between what I need and what you need.
mm,
And so if people are expressing a sorrow to you and you don't feel that sorrow is necessarily warranted, we can shift into, but they are doing a thing that they feel is socially appropriate. They're playing to those social norms. I can appreciate that they are sorry for me, even if I don't feel sorry this thing happened.
mhm,
And that's that dialectic thinking, right? We're holding two different thoughts in our head at the same time. And the neurodivergent brain is either really good at holding multiple thoughts in our head or really bad at it. And it sort of can shift from moment to moment. Um,
As in holding thoughts as in like, I have to express this now. Like, you've got multiple thoughts and you can't not say what they are.
well, that's definitely a thing. I was thinking more holding different thoughts in your head.
Mm,
Like, I need to go, I need to cook dinner, but it would be so much easier to order food. So those are dialectic thoughts. They're sort
mhm,
of heating in your brain. And the ADHD brain in particular will sort of let those thoughts mushroom and you sort of whip back and forth between making a decision. But a lot of neurodivergent people, especially more on the gifted and autistic side of things, will, it's like, I want to cook dinner. And like, well, it's actually 3 in the afternoon. So
mm,
it's time to cook dinner, but I'd like to cook dinner now. It's
mm,
that sort of rigidity. And so a big part of what I do in my job is helping people push back against that cognitive rigidity and give them the flexibility of thought and thus feeling and behavior that gives them more flexibility in the world. Because when we are a slave to our own thoughts, we've taken our hands off that steering wheel, right? And now we're letting our thoughts run the show for us.
Hmm. So I wonder, because one of the things we wanted to get into, I was quite interested in the sciencey parts about how the brain is working, and what you've just described there is a scenario where a situation is happening, and you've spoken about how you work with people, and I would like to talk about how you might solve issues like that. But I wonder if this is the moment we can actually talk about what is, from a scientific point of view, what is happening in the brain in certain situations like that.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of brain science to unpack here. And it's one of my favorite things to talk about because I just think it's just so fascinating.
Mm.
I mean, what we know about the brain now in 2024, hugely different than we knew 20 years ago and probably even 10 years ago. I mean, our understanding of the brain is rapidly expanding. And also, it is arguably the most complex thing in the universe, right? I mean, it is amazing how little we know about the thing that's, at the top of our heads. So when we think about the neurodivergent brain, the differences tend to show up in 4 specific areas. There's obviously a lot more nuance, but we only have so much time. So the first thing we'll talk about is our friend, the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
Right. Prefrontal cortex is, that's where our executive functioning system is. In basically every neurodivergent system, the prefrontal cortex is weaker. And specifically, obviously it's indicated in ADHD, but a lot of giftedness comes with executive dysfunction as well. Are you familiar with the sort of the trope of the absent-minded professor?
No.
So it's sort of this idea that you're smart enough to be a professor, a Cambridge Don, as it were, and you show up to teach your class and you've forgotten your papers,
Right.
right? Or it's time to take the exam, but you forgot to make copies of the exam. This sort of absent-minded professor trope is, I mean, that's really, those are my clients.
So
Right?
you've got the skills and the knowledge to be a professor, but somewhere along the line, you've got a deficiency in the ability to get to places on time with your stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it creates that sort of weird dynamic that those things sort of feel like cross purposes. Like, how are you smart enough to get this job? Because you can talk about particle physics or the works of Shakespeare or do mathematical equations, but you forgot to put on a tie this morning, or you left your coffee on top of your car.
Mm.
And that's the neurodivergent experience for a lot of my clients, and certainly for people who are gifted and twice exceptional, is how come my brain lets me do these amazing things? And also, how come I can't do these simple, basic things that it seems that everybody else can do?
I'm wondering, you used the word weakness with regards to the prefrontal cortex and the executive functions. I'm trying to think of the right words to use. So let's say the equipment within that prefrontal cortex, is that all typical, or is it, I mean, I'm wondering if my understanding of it is correct. Is the equipment's okay, it's just that it's not got enough fuel in it to run it efficiently. Is that the case, or is there something else going on?
Wow. You really know your stuff, my friend. This is why you're so much fun to talk to. So it's actually both. So the fuel, right? We talked about that dopamine circuit that
Yeah.
our prefrontal cortex runs on. So to sort of scale down the science on this, when we do anything, we gain dopamine, right? Well, we need dopamine both to start the car, but also to keep it running. So everything we do ideally adds more dopamine to our system. But when you're a neurodivergent person, your brain requires more dopamine to keep that thing going, which means that when we do the things we love, we get that extra dopamine, right? It's not just, oh, hey, I enjoy fish and chips. It's, I love fish and chips. It's extra plus 10 dopamine to me.
Well, thanks for the British reference there.
Oh, I mean, I'm really hard not to just like completely sell out and do nothing but on this. But the other side of that is that when it's something you don't like,
Mm.
when it's something that's hurtful, that your brain doesn't engage in, then you quickly are pulling out of your spare, your extra dopamine to get these tasks done.
Mm.
And this is why neurodivergent people are so prone to burnout, because we are pulling from tomorrow's store of dopamine to get through today. So you're not starting tomorrow, at 0, flat, ready to go. You're starting at -10. So you're
Mm.
behind the 8 ball when you wake up in the morning,
Yeah.
and you're sort of trying to catch up all day. And if you think about it, as you listen to this podcast, right? Think about the days where you get to do all the things you want, right? You are, you're writing your book, or you're hanging out with your friends, or you go to a party, or you finish a big task that you've been working on. Super mega dopamine, you're flying, you feel awesome. Think about that day, the other day, where it's like you have to sort all the papers in your dad's attic. And it just, this is drier than dirt, man. This is awful. And your brain is, you just leave and you feel like you're just like an overheated car, right? You're just smoking. That's the power of this dopamine circuit in the brain. But it's also the way that it's set up, the neurons and the connections in that prefrontal cortex actually develop slower in neurodivergent people than neurotypical people.
Mm.
So it's both that dopamine pump, but also the physical connections in that part of the brain. So you could see it as a neurotypical person, their prefrontal cortex fully develops somewhere between 20 and 25. So that's sort of like mid-university to your early 20s, that era. ADHDers, their prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until closer to 30. So you've got an extra decade or so where your brain is still coming online, still developing that. It's a much longer runway, which means you're going to have more challenges and struggles than your neurotypical peers, because their brains are, fully evolving, and your brains just need more time to get to that place.
Mm.
Which is why, with the work you and I do, providing that external motivation, that scaffolding, that coaching, at worst, it props up that prefrontal cortex. At best, it actually strengthens it, because it is like a muscle. The more you work it, the stronger it gets.
Mm. There's a metaphor that I like to use, which is like the fuel gauge in a car. So when we were talking about like the fuel, and if you're thinking about dopamine, is that within ADHD, we're more typically going to be lower down. And once it gets to a certain point, there's a light that comes on the dashboard or a sound that goes beep. So automatically, your first reaction as the driver is to say, where are we going to get some fuel now? And we've got to find a new route, which is off our route where we're trying to go, because we're thinking about now is where are we going to get fuel in order to get where we're going. So it takes us longer to get to our goal, our destination, because we're constantly having to pull off and that's where the distraction comes in.
I mean, I love that metaphor. And I think the funny thing about ADHD in particular is that when your brain is working well, it's like that same car's engine has extra fuel that nobody else's car has. So you're driving, 100K down the M5 and leaving everybody else in the dust. You're like, come on, guys, catch up.
Yeah.
Like, we haven't even left Brighton yet. Come on, just
Yeah.
slow down.
Yeah.
Right? So it's that, I mean, it's a condition of extremes. We tend to struggle when other people don't struggle, and we tend to do great when everybody else is struggling.
Mm.
And that, and this is the beautiful complexity of having an ADHD brain.
Mm. I wonder, when you mentioned sort of the ability within gifted brains, and this is probably an overgeneralization, but is it what you've just described, that when a gifted person is able to express or complete those gifted abilities, is that because they are so interested in it that they're using their executive functions on their, highly charged? Or is there a different part of the brain? I'm trying to think of specific specific activities that might actually be using a different part of the brain, or those gifted abilities in the executive functioning. It's about being able to activate them. I think
I
that's
mean, Yeah, it's a great question. And it really, it's mostly about that prefrontal cortex. There are other parts of the brain that impact its development. I mean, not the least of which is the limbic system, our emotional centers of our brain. But most of the work I do is really sort of developing the skills in that prefrontal cortex, because that allows people to level up and handle more of life's challenges more easily and with more and leaving more in the tank when it's done. Because otherwise you're just sort of white knuckling everything. You're just trying to grit your teeth and survive all this stuff. And, I don't want my clients to have to survive. I want my clients to thrive.
Mm,
And if I can help them develop some strategies in their brain to make things easier, well, shoot, then, you've gone from using maximum effort to get something done to just a regular amount of effort, which means all that effort you didn't use is staying in your dopamine bank, and it's stuff you can use later in the day to get through more stuff.
I think because you mentioned earlier, the doing exams at school, getting away with it. It's probably okay at that period in your life, but if that's the same way you approach everything, leaving everything to the last minute, that over time, that's gonna create more and more stress, and maybe we're not gonna always get away with it, not do it as well as we could have, and that's probably gonna lead to burnout and
Mhm.
poor mental health, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we see. I mean, we've got to find ways to put parts of our lives that are going to be high dopamine rewards in, and that doesn't mean you get to quit your job as an accountant and tap dance, but it does mean that if tap dancing is something that fuels you, you want to make sure you take a tap dance class every week, right?
Mm,
I mean, it's not all or nothing. It's about layering things in. If you have a job where most of your responsibilities are things that drain you and make you miserable, but there are parts of your job that absolutely fire you up and you love doing them, well, then we need to talk to your boss and say, how do we do more of the stuff that plays to my strengths and less of the stuff that plays to my weaknesses?
mhm,
And this might seem like some radical idea, but it's something that we all do in our lives anyway. And I mean, I run a small business, right? I have a therapy practice and my coach and my speaking job. And I know what I'm good at. I'm good at making connections with people. I'm good at talking. I'm good at doing the therapy part. If it was up to me, I would only see the clients and then a magical machine would take care of the scheduling and the billing and running the credit cards and all that other stuff.
yeah,
Right. And as my life has gone on, my career has evolved. I've hired people to do a lot of that stuff for me because that's what was dragging me down. It's
mm,
never, give me a depressed, overwhelmed, panic attack client. I'll do that all day. That fires me up. But then I have to write a 3-page note about that session. I'm like, oh my God, this is death. I hate
mm,
it. Right. And so, how do we find systems and structures that allow us to do more of the stuff that we actually want to do and less of the stuff that drains us?
yeah. As you were speaking there, I was imagining the accountant's office and somebody going, "What's that noise?" And it's like, "It's Kevin. He's tap dancing under the desk. Yeah, his feet are going." So we've covered one area of the brain, and you said there were four. So what else have we got? What's the next one?
So, second part, and it ties nicely into the prefrontal cortex, is the limbic system.
Yeah.
The limbic system is a series of structures in our brain that identifies emotional feelings and whips them through the brain. And the idea here is, this gets into that sort of lizard brain, wizard brain, the old brain versus the new brain stuff. You know, our brains developed when we were hominids on the African plains, and they were saber-toothed tigers that were trying to eat us, right? We weren't alpha predators. So when you hear a rustling in the bushes, some ancient part of your brain goes, danger, right? And it prepares you to fight, it prepares you to get ready. The problem is that there are no more saber-toothed tigers. So now you're getting that whole am I in danger bodily response to stuff like a Twitter notification
Hmm.
or, you texted your girlfriend and your girlfriend hasn't texted you back for an hour,
Mm.
right? So now we have this am I in mortal danger response to things that are still important, but less mortal, let's say, in terms of extreme danger. And the more neurodivergent you are, the more the limbic system is wired into the internal structures of the brain.
Mm.
And the more emotionality comes with our thoughts and feelings and behaviors and our memories. So when those things come up, they just show up in the prefrontal cortex, ready to be processed and done something with more emotionality. So we just tend to have bigger feelings more often that last longer. And that prefrontal cortex's job is to inhibit our behavior, right? So you get mad and you go, I need to take a minute, versus you get mad and you punch a hole in the drywall, right? When you're a neurodivergent person, those connections move a lot faster. They pick up more emotion, and the brake system on that car is weaker. So you are more likely to punch a hole in the drywall or flip a table or scream at your partner, or or a lot of things that are more maladaptive in terms of coping strategies.
Mm.
Just because the feelings we have are much more dysregulating to us.
So I wonder if there any advice on, let's say, let's like the limbic system, the lizard brain, it's been triggered by an interaction with somebody, and the lizard brain is saying, "Oh, that's outrageous. Here's my response," or "This is what I think about that." Whereas the prefrontal cortex is saying, "Well, that's not a logical solution. That's not what's going on here." But they're having this fight. How can you help out the limbic system to reframe that thought? And so I'm trying to illustrate the fact that you've got two opposing views in your head. So how do you cleanse that, reframe that one that's not helpful?
So it's important to start with that feelings are not good or bad. They simply exist, right? Feelings are data, they're not directions.
Mm.
So a lot of what we get into is what we call the struggle switch. And so, let's say, so like this morning, I was trying to get my kids breakfast, right? And my son could not pick what he wanted for breakfast. I went through everything in the house. I was gonna cook him a steak. I mean, that's how like much I needed to feed him. And I got frustrated that he was taking a long time to pick what he wanted for breakfast. Now, in an ideal world, I feel frustrated. I say, yep, I'm feeling frustrated. I am entitled to feel that way. And I name that emotion, which activates my parasympathetic nervous system, and I calm down. That's what I should do. What actually happened was frustrated. And then I got mad at myself for being frustrated. And then I got anxious that I was mad at myself for being frustrated, because I don't like to be mad. It makes me worried. And then I got bummed out that I was anxious, that I was mad at myself for being frustrated. And that's where the meltdown comes from,
Mm.
right? Because these feelings just stack on top of each other. Now, being very aware of that, my tendency to do that, I was able to step out of that system. I said, oh, I need a minute. I need a break. Went outside, took a deep breath, you know, looked at the sun, felt better, went back inside and made myself some waffles, which he then ate, and it was fine.
Mm.
Right. So one of the things we need to do to sort of give emotions less control over us is start from a place of what we call radical acceptance. This is the thing I'm feeling. I don't have to like it. I don't have to not like it, but it is what I am feeling. And we connect that radical acceptance to I am entitled to feel however I feel about whatever I feel. That is my right as a human being. What I do with those feelings, that's where I can make choices, right? If you're really upset that you're sitting in traffic, you have a right to be upset about you're sitting in traffic. You don't have a right to slam into the car in front of you to get them to move faster, right? And I think this is where a lot of our discourse as a society has broken down, because people say, well, I'm allowed to be angry. You are allowed to be angry. There's a lot of things to be angry about, but you don't get to make choices that impact other people because of your anger. And that's where I think, personal accountability really matters, and some things sort of bog down in those spaces. So feelings are inevitable, and they aren't good or bad. They just are. where we get to make positive change in our lives is shifting from this is what I'm feeling to this is what I do with that feeling. Always trying to make safer, more pro-social choices.
So you mentioned there, like taking a second to go outside, take a deep breath. That's sort of a very immediate action to help you calm down. I wonder, do you use anything, a bit like CBT in order to maybe at a later time to maybe reframe some of those triggering aspects of that thing?
And and that's exactly what we're doing. I mean, because we have to change our relationship to those thoughts. I mean, neurodivergent people, but particularly my ADHDers, can be so mean to themselves. So many of those automatic thoughts are, I suck, I'm a screw up, I'm never going to get better at this. And when things happen, when we make inevitable mistakes, those file folders open up and those scripts start playing, right? You screw up, you screwed up again. I can't believe you keep screwing up at this. How dare you, et cetera, et cetera. It's so harsh, and and as someone who struggles with that myself, I can say to my clients from a place of like genuine empathy, it's like, yeah, I hate when my brain talks to me that way.
Mm.
So one of the things that, we do is and I find this to be a helpful strategy for a lot of my neurodivergent clients, is that when that voice starts playing in your head, look at you, you got mad again, you screw up, you're never going to get your anger under control. Part of the reason that's hard to deal with is that we're arguing with our own voice, we're arguing with ourselves. So what we do is we change that voice in our head. Imagine you had like a dial that you could change the voice. So you do an impression of somebody, right? So, you could do Yoda. Like, I never knew what right now, that's a passable Yoda impression. But what it is, it's ridiculous. Your brain is like, I'm not going to argue with Yoda, right? That's absurd. If we had a dialect coach when I did theater in college, and she was an amazing dialect coach. And whenever she got angry at us, she would do the most like grating Cockney British accent. Like, because when she didn't think we were working hard enough in our accent work,
Yeah.
She's like, "Out, isn't it that governor?" Right? It's just like every American thinks British people sound like,
It's
right?
the Mary
But
Poppins.
yeah, right. But if that voice was playing in my head, like, "That will be a good husband, didn't it?" I'd be like, "Oh, I can't listen to that voice." And
Yeah.
now I'm changing my reaction to it.
Yeah.
So if you're not an accent person, if you're not an impressions person, then add some helium.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
no one is going to argue with a little baby voice like that. The idea is that we don't treat our thoughts as immutable objects handed down to us from God.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, this is a thought that popped into my head and I can change how I respond to it, And one of the coolest things I get to say to a client is like, you've probably had thoughts in your life that I can't do it, that I'll never succeed at this, right? And they're like, yeah, totally. I'm like, and yet here you are.
Mm-hmm.
Your track record of getting through difficult things is 100% because you're still here. You may not have gotten through them the way you wanted to. You didn't maximize your returns on all those things, but you are much more capable than you think you are. And how freaking cool is that?
Mm. Yeah. I have to thank you because usually when I'm editing this podcast, it takes me a bit of time to find the clips for social media, but you just given me 3, so that's amazing.
You're welcome.
You mentioned the theatre. You were studying the theatre at school, was it? And it just reminds me of what you were saying before, because in Hamlet, Shakespeare used to say that there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And that's exactly what. So he knew what he was talking about. What is number 3? What's the third area?
Third area is something that has been a steep learning curve for me.
Yeah.
And that's the parietal lobe on top of our head. And that's where our sensory input comes from.
Oh.
We know that a lot of neurodivergent people are easily overwhelmed by sensory input because we tend to be hypersensitive to it. ever since I had kids, I am hypersensitive to auditory overstimulation. If like 3 people are talking to me at the same time and the TV's on in the background and my cat is meowing, I'm like, I can't, like my body starts to shut down, right? Because all that stuff is just it's felt so much more deeply, right?
Mm.
So a lot of neurodivergent people spend their whole lives struggling with things like my socks have to feel a certain way, or I can't wear a collared shirt, or I hate wearing bras or ties or belts or high-heeled shoes, makeup, right? Those are things that a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with, which puts us outside the monoculture, right? Because everybody else is doing those things. And if you don't know that those are sensory needs, that is literally your body telling you something, you're going to default to a mindset of that it's your fault you screw up. Why are you so weird?
Mm.
And, and I have I have a good colleague who a few years ago, I'm sorry, a good friend who's a colleague a few years ago is like, I'm not wearing ties when I present anymore. I hate them. I hate wearing ties. I don't think they make me look any more professional. And I'm telling you, I've known this guy for half a decade at this point. In the 3 years since he stopped wearing ties, he's a better presenter because
Mhm.
now he doesn't have this tight thing around his neck. And maybe nobody likes this, but if you're a neurodivergent person, it moves past dislike to discomfort. I can't concentrate. I can't breathe. I can't regulate myself because things are too tight. I feel that sensory input. And I think that's the thing a lot of neurodivergent people don't understand, um, that is impacting them as much as it is. And then our last part of the brain, which, like I said, we can obviously talk about more, but I think this is another part that people tend to not know about is mirror neurons. Now, Lawrence, what do you know about mirror neurons?
Nothing.
Well, then get ready. I'm going to blow your mind here for a second, buddy. So right now, our brains are doing things and our brains are also watching each other do things. Mirror neurons basically exist all over in your brain, but primarily in your temples. And we're social creatures, right? When we think about that lizard brain, wizard brain thing, that when we're hominids, if you were in a pack of hominids and one of your buddies looked to the east because they heard a noise, your brain had to monitor what they were doing because maybe that keeps you alive.
Mm.
Because if there's a lion coming, you need lion, and now I'm running, and maybe I'm the second person who ran, thus I'm more likely to survive and pass on my genes. So these days, our brains are constantly seeking out other data from other people. But when you're neurodivergent, your mirror neurons move at a different rate than when you're neurotypical. So I can see guitar in the background of that. So like instead of 4/4 time, if neurotypical people are 4/4 time, neurodivergent people are 7/8 time. There are times where the beats sync up, right? It's like,
Mhm.
okay, here we are, we've aligned in these moments, but most of the time our brains are doing something different. So this feeling you have when you're in a social group where it feels like they all know something that you don't know, they're all doing something that you can't do. Part of that comes from these mirror neurons who are like trying really hard to understand what that is, but they're moving too fast to get all the information. So
Mm.
part of being left behind. So one of my favorite exercises to do is, have you ever heard the expression that yawns are contagious?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I yawn, right? And a room full of people, and lots of people will yawn because I yawned,
Yeah.
because their mirror neurons are going, am I tired?
Uh-huh.
Because when the mirror neurons watch you do something, they fire like you're actually doing it. They give you just a scaled down version of that. But then when your brain sees that, it goes, wait, do I actually need to do that myself? And may actually trigger you to do so. Another way to do that is if you're in a group of people, have a sip of water, because everybody's like, am I thirsty? I guess I'm thirsty. I'm going to have, and when I do this exercise, there's almost always one person who grabs their water and drinks. I'm like, I got you to do it. And they look
Mhm.
at it like, where did my water bottle come from? So that's really cool. But if your mirror neurons are offbeat, if they're out of rhythm with what everybody else is doing, it gives you this sort of lurking sense of disquiet. of like everybody else is on a different vibe than I am, and why am I not on that vibe?
Mm,
It's your brain is quite literally picking up different pieces of information and prioritizing it in a different way. That's not good or bad. It just means you may need to be more intentional with getting on other people's wavelengths when you're in a group of people.
mm,
So if they want to go to the pub and watch Arsenal and Chelsea, you may need to work hard to find those rhythms, but once you find them, then you can absolutely ride those waves with them. But it may take an intentional effort from your brain to do so.
mm. Because a lot of people, well, a lot of people say that a common trait with people with ADHD is to be very empathetic. And I wonder if that comes from that feeling of feeling out of sync with everybody. So you pay more attention to it. So you are observing people's, when they're speaking, what they're saying, or observing their facial expressions. It might be because you're thinking, well, what should my facial expression be in order to be appropriate for this situation? But yeah, is that where the mirror neurons are coming into play?
Absolutely. You nailed it. And
Yeah.
that's why I think a lot of neurodivergent people are more comfortable online,
Mm,
because it's the only thing we're getting is text.
mhm,
We're not having to read all of those extra data points. And even talking on Zoom, we're basically looking at each other from our shoulders up.
mm,
So it's less stuff to pay attention to. It just decreases the workload on the brain. So our brain feels a little bit more flexible and a little bit more able to, acclimate to what's going on. On the other side of that, the more people who are in that Zoom room, the more people who are in the chat, then our brains are trying to monitor 11 different things, and that's how we can get bogged down and overwhelmed.
mm,
Now, it happens to everybody, but it is much more likely to happen to neurodivergent people, and that's much more likely to come with a higher cost.
mm. 'Cause I often, and I think I've mentioned it before, but I quite often, when I'm talking to somebody and I'm listening to them talk, I can hear like two or three voices in my head, like taking notes of things, thinking about things that I want to respond to show that I've listened, but then worrying, well, if I say that, then maybe that's taking away from the fact that they've just told me that. And it's like, so I'm like assessing so many different things about what I'm going to do next, which if it's overloaded, means that I stop listening. If it does, is that typical of a neurotypical person? Do they have an internal dialogue when they're listening to people, or is it more common in people with ADHD?
So I was just doing some research on this for my book, and it's the data are very mixed. A lot of conclusions you can draw when it comes to neurodivergent people tend to be bimodal distributions, where it's either we have the biggest version of it or it not at all, right? So I find that neurodivergent people either have no internal monologue or a very loud internal monologue,
Mm,
whereas most neurotypical people seem to have more of that like Jiminy Cricket voice in your head that's every so often like, hey, you shouldn't do that. And it shows up every once in a while. Ours is more, it's either like, you know, you know, like the volume turned up to 11 and ripped the knob off like in Spinal Tap, or like absolute crickets.
mhm. I mean, it sounds a little similar to when we were talking about the emotional regulation part, that the prefrontal cortex is not able to quieten down the limbic system, and it sounds like the conversation that's happening is it's like I can't get this one to shut up, whereas maybe in a neurotypical person they're just like, let's just focus on what they're saying and wait until there's an opportunity to to you know, respond.
Yeah. And I think that's where we see that response is probably the biggest takeaway we can have from working with neurodivergent people, which is our response is a thing we have control over. And however we respond this time is a data point to inform how we will respond next time. If you crush it, do you want to do that again? If you screw it up, how can we learn from this moment, right? We are so hard on ourselves. We expect such perfection from ourselves that is not really possible or sustainable. So all we can do is be curious, not furious with
Mm.
ourselves, right? Yeah, it's one of my favorites. You put it on some bumper stickers.
That's good. I'll just have to write that one down. So I'm just conscious of we're running towards, we've run over a little bit, but I just wanted to make sure I asked you about the Neurodivergent Collective that you are co-founder of. Tell us a bit more about what you do there.
So the Neurodiversity Collective is our therapy practice. We've got myself, and then we have two coaches, an academic coach and a job coach to help neurodivergent people navigate those systems. We're looking to hire more people because we've got more work than we know what to do with. And then, so that's my full-time job. My other full-time job is booking speaking engagements and trainings. I fly all over the country and sometimes all over the world. I'm heading back out to Europe in March to go to the Netherlands and do a talk there. And hopefully in 2026, I'll be speaking at the European Council for High Ability Conference, which will be in Dublin. So, I mean, I never thought in a million years that being a professional nerd would take me all over the country and all over the world, but I'm really lucky that these things get to happen.
Fantastic. And you mentioned you're writing a book at the moment.
Yes.
Or,
So my book is called the NeuroDiversity Playbook. And it's a lot of what we talked about today, like using brain science to inform what we do, why we do it, and how it happens. Because when we give ourselves that knowledge, then we create empathy for ourselves and we can better shape our behavior from a place of, now I know why this is happening. And since I know that, I can work smarter, not harder, to change my behavior.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. It was as enjoyable as I was hoping it was going to be. And I will put in the show notes a link to your website and any other things that you would like me to point people in the direction of. And yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great to speak to you, Dr. Matt.
Truly, I mean, this is one of the better conversations I think I've had on any podcast. And you're just create such a cool space to have these conversations. And you're so, you're a great host. So
Oh,
it's truly a treat for me to get to talk to you.
oh, well, thank you very much. I'm blushing now. All right, great. Well, I wish you all the best with completing the book and your speaking engagements that you've got coming up. So, all the best. And thank you very much.
You, my friend, have a great day.
Take care. There we have it. Thank you so much for listening this far. If you want to hear more episodes, then please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use. It really helps to spread the word. So if you know anyone this episode could help, then please share it with your friends. If you want to follow me on social media, I am on Instagram at ADHD_goals, and you can find me on Facebook too. If you want to get in touch with the show, then you can email me at hello@adhdgoals.co. And finally, if you're struggling to manage your ADHD and you would like me to be your coach, then please head over to my website and get in touch. Until next time, bye for now.